welcome to everyone here, joined by my friend and colleague Anand for what I hope will be a robust discussion on some polling that we have conducted in the UK primarily, but also France and Germany, on attitudes towards some specific themes. I think the next slide, Manon mentioned really at the beginning, what we'll be talking about. This presentation we originally presented 2 weeks ago for the Centre of European Policy Studies in Brussels. And these were the four themes, and obviously it makes a mnemonic, but broadly we think there are four big challenges that are facing European policymakers. And we wanted to let them know what we thought the public thought on these specific issues and what the challenges were, because a lot of people are talking about the policy challenges. We wanted to make clear what the democratic challenges were. These are security, by that we mean kind of defence, and obviously the situation in Ukraine and Russia, immigration, which we think is discussed a lot in the UK, but not necessarily on the continent to a sufficient degree that it should be, particularly with the results of the German election. And we also kind of want to look into two particular economic themes. The third is of no growth. Europe has been an ex-growth continent for nearly 2 decades. In my working lifetime, has moved from being in parity with the US to being outstripped by it on almost every possible metric, the response of which has been a compass quite recently. And the fourth is on social spending. Europe spends up to 45% of the world's social spending. It's about 7% of the public. What's the challenge there? How does Europe grapple with that? Is it going to show signs of getting serious? All of these. So the first kind of theme, as we discussed, is security. We just kind of want to really flag straight up, I think, the lack of consensus on views on defensive spending. So in view of what is happening on the continent, we found that it was surprising that fewer than half voters across these 3 jurisdictions, 1,000 people were polled in each, were happy with an increase in defence spending, even if that meant higher taxes or cuts in other areas. We saw a pretty stable amount of people, around a third, who wanted to maintain, and roughly between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 voters wanted to reduce the defence budget when Europe is dealing with its current crises, in terms of reducing it, even if it reduced military readiness. So from our perspective, policymakers in Europe might be very clear about what the direction is, but there is a huge complexity around what is happening in terms of voters and their responses to defence spending. And this will have a long half-life. As defence spending actually goes up, voters will respond in kind to whether they perceive about efficiencies in regards to that. And I don't know if you have any kind of reaction to this first slide, but my first thought was total kind of lack of consensus. Like, if there is political leadership, it basically hasn't folded over into then leading public opinion, with the lack of consensus.
I mean, I'd say yes and no to that. I mean, on the one hand, I think if you'd looked at these figures a year ago, they'd be very different. So I think there will have been an impact. But on the difference between states is really interesting, because in general, when you poll about this sort of thing in Europe, you basically get a geographical pattern. As the further east you are, the higher that number will be, favouring increasing in defence spending. And the further west you go, if you compare Portugal and Spain, for instance, you'll get a massive difference between the two. And it's just simply a question of threat perception. If you look at what's actually happening in terms of public policy, the Poles are now spending over 5% of GDP on defence. A lot of the Baltic states are aiming to get to 5%. We're struggling in this country, despite our relatively high figure compared to others, to get to 2.5. And I think, there's a very, very, very simple geostrategic or geographic explanation for this. Is the closer you are to Russia, the more scared you feel, and that affects your attitudes.
Yeah, I think on a more consensual note, when we presented this to a number of policymakers, the next slide I think makes quite clear that European nations are quite keen for further collaboration between European allies and foreign policy. What this actually means, though, is the key exam question. Like, this is a very nice sentiment. What does that mean? What does collaboration mean? Is it about kind of merged strategy? What does it say in regards to budgets and technology and what people do? What does it mean to even collaborate? For me, this is the things that will have to be fleshed out. But I think it was interesting that underneath the trends of support for further increased spending, the increase in desire for collaboration was quite interesting. I think, though, the next slide on NATO support is interesting. NATO, it is interesting that the UK continues to be slightly adjunct to a number of different European values, I would say. Continues to be, we would suggest, one of the strongest supporters of NATO in Europe. and now probably the world, given the situation, what's going on in the US, with only 16% of voters wanting to leave NATO outright. I mean, for me, and I remember back to the challenges that Jeremy Corbyn faced back in kind of 2018, 2019. A lot of it was around the mood music behind the strength that the then Labour Party had on defence and its perceptions over being wary about NATO. For me, this seems like one of the most critical hygiene factors to any British politician. But it's also quite interesting from a French and German kind of perspective. I think that the reaction to Marine Le Pen, so a lot of the actions of the US has been very, very telling in terms of her response. I mean, what's your instinctive response to this slide, Anand?
My first reaction to what you were saying was just how old I am, because when you said I remember, I thought you were going to say the Euro missiles crisis in the early 1980s, which is what I was thinking about, because back then, of course, there was a significant movement on the left that was anti-NATO. And it's amazing the degree to which public opinion has shifted. There's a couple of things here. I mean, one of them is, I think, to do with perceptions of your role within organizations. Now, in France, they've been conditioned by many, many years of political rhetoric to believe that they don't get enough say over what happens in NATO. In this country, we've been conditioned by decades of political rhetoric to think that we lead in NATO. So I'm not sure this necessarily is indicative of our views towards collaboration. I think it's indicative of our views towards collaboration in a specific institution, which is associated with the Americans. Just a quick point on the previous slide, which I think you made the point, and it's worth ramming it home. You get so many of these polls that say, we would like to collaborate more with Europe. Well, of course we would, because the world is dangerous and we need to have friends. The real devil always with those questions is, what does that mean? Does that mean we're going to share our nuclear deterrent with European countries? I suspect the numbers will be very different on that. Does that mean we're going to create a European army with some supranational power that gets to decide when we go to war? I suspect you won't get much support for that. So on all those things, working more closely and being nice to our partners, fair enough. But actually, if you dig down into that, and I hope you do this sometime, actually, James, at Focal, is to try and ask some more specific questions about what that means, because I think there you'll find real divergence between countries.
Yeah, watch this space. And I guess my other reflection on this slide is France continuing to be a slightly more defence skeptic country. I mean, certainly its views are much more split than, say, Germany or the UK. Even when it comes to the next slide, which is on Ukraine funding. And again, we don't have the full list of countries here. Throughout the year, we're going to be polling extensively across the continent on issues of defence. But from our perspective, the UK continuing to be one of the strongest supporters of wanting to not decrease of how much we cut back on aid to Ukraine. Like, the slides have, I think, temporarily gone. But basically, our polling shows that 43% of Brits want to keep our financial support at a similar level to Ukraine in the past few years. Around a third of French and Germans, and around 1 in 4 voters across those three countries think we should increase, and around 1 in 3 to actually 45%, 44% in France want to cut back. For me, this was really, really striking, particularly those French and German numbers are out. Now, European policymakers, and you could even argue Keir Starmer, will have a challenge improving as we increase defence spending that is being spent well.
No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, there are two bits to it, aren't there? One is how much we spend on defence. The other is how much we give to Ukraine. And of course, the really difficult dilemma about Ukraine is not whether we should maintain current spending levels or not, but in the event that the Americans stop doing what they're doing, whether Europeans are in a position to fill a gap. And I think this slide, plus the earlier one about whether we should be increasing taxes to increase defence spending, speak to the fact that when it gets to the really nasty questions about, does your support for Ukraine stretch to paying more in taxation? What looks like a fairly broad united front in some countries crumbles quite quickly. And I think politicians are going to have to get on the front foot about making that case if those are the choices they're going to impose on us.
Okay. Great. I mean, I think we're on to one of my most interesting slides. So taking a step back up to a world of which countries perceive as their friends and their enemies. This is quite a simplistic way of looking at politics. But again, we're asking voters, we're not asking geopolitical experts. But a couple of themes came out to me from this slide. The first was, I think in the UK has a very different perception of who its closest allies are than to Central European countries. This reflects to me polling that YouGov conducted 2 years ago, which was which countries thought they were most similar to. And again, you saw a very similar disjuncture. It's very, very clear to me from the polling here that the UK continues to be closer to what people call Hanzuk, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and I think added to that is obviously the Republic of Ireland. But interestingly, France and Germany, much lower numbers for the UK, much more commitment to other major European powers in the European Union, but far more consensus on who they consider hostile enemies. I mean, it's a massive question, but you are Professor of European Politics, so I'll put it to you. How do you see all these kind of laced alignments going? All these like geopolitical shifts? Like, to me, it's not clear how the West will merge, demerge, converge together with or without the US, and in what shape and in what form, either from a political perspective or actually a public opinion perspective. It's very complicated. You know, we've not included, for example, the polling here of everyday Canadians, where in Canada we've seen a catastrophic fall for the numbers of Canadians who think of the US as an ally and the most common ally. But obviously that's also had an effect over here. So it's a big question, but that's what we're here for, big questions.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And of course, in Canada now, things are absolutely in flux. I mean, in Canada, they've started polling on whether Canada should join the EU, for heaven's sake. So this is a very different world to the world we lived in 6 months ago. And I think it's a really open question because one of the things that's been very obvious in the diplomacy around what Trump is doing in Ukraine is we're not sure what our coalitions are. We're not sure who's in, who's out. We keep meeting in different subsets of European and transatlantic states. And so I don't think we know what or who the West is anymore. And if genuinely, as some people say, we're in epoch-changing times with what's happening in the United States, it's going to take a while, I think, before we settle on a pattern of who are the people we're going to rely on and who are the people we're going to work closely with. I think the other thing that's fascinating about this slide is the degree to which it shows how Germany thinks of foreign policy as multilateral rather than nation-state based. That actually the idea that you're dealing with individual nation states is not something the Germans think about anymore. With the one exception of France, because of that special relationship, it is absolutely fascinating that they're two closest apart from that of the EU and NATO, which obviously from a British point of view is just not how we think at all.
Great. And I think, look, given time, with 15 minutes per one of the four letters of the acronym, we're on to immigration. And again, Anand, we'll flip to the next slide, but my reflection is I think European audiences hear a lot less about how immigration skeptic European countries are than, say, British audiences. For us, it's very clear. We have almost daily polls dropping in. You have big trackers from large companies like Ipsos and YouGov. We have a large saturated polling ecosystem where the polling is extremely clear on this issue, which is that people currently think that migration numbers have been too high. But I want to roll back a couple of years, Anand, to a conference where we were both speaking at, where attitudes towards immigration were liberalising quite quickly. I was very sceptical that liberalisation would be permanent as numbers went up. So I want to ask you, what changed since 2 years ago? And secondly, do you think that European political parties are reflexively responding to numbers like this? So, for example, in Germany and France and the UK, we've recently had, obviously, the German election with the AfD performing extremely strongly. We obviously have Reform UK polling first in many polls, second in some, third in some, but, you know, broadly three parties that are co-equal. Do you think that currently political systems understand the scale of this challenge? And what do you think is going to happen to this type of polling, absent a change in real numbers?
Okay, well, I mean, you realize there's about 8 questions there, so I'm not going to answer all of them, but let me say several things. I mean, the big change has been, I think, in this country that the salience of immigration has gone up quite significantly over the last few years for a variety of reasons, partly the emphasis placed on it by the S.I.N.S government and by Reform UK, partly because of genuine concern about numbers, partly because, as you'll come to earlier, the lack of growth, consequent failing of public services and things like that, that all gets tied into the immigration debate. I just give a word of caution about what you were saying about the AfD doing well, because, I mean, there's an interesting question about the AfD, whether they did well or did poorly, in the sense that they sort of peaked at about 20% in an election during which situation was almost ideal for them. All the other parties, the Greens, the SPD and the CDU, were tainted with a government that had failed. You'd had no economic growth in Germany for 4 or 5 years. immigration was the major issue in the country. And of course, all these German figures in your polling needs to be looked at in the context of the horrible attacks that took place in Germany in the run up to the election. The circumstances were almost ideal for the AfD in the run up to that election. So I would say the jury's slightly out as to whether you say 20% that's impressive or 20% even in those favourable conditions. Is that really as good as they would have been hoping for? I'm not convinced it necessarily is.
Well, I mean, one of the things we were talking about before this session went live is the difficulty that people have in naming the populist right or the
Yeah,
radical right, because clearly the AfD, Front National, Reform UK, they're not the same thing. You have different voters, different vote shares, different ceilings, different floors. Obviously, we've seen in France the ability for Front National to penetrate quite widely. A lot of people in the UK don't understand that there are a number of parties that sit to the right of Front National. You know, we've not talked about Eric Zemmour, who consistently stands, we've not talked about Jan, who consistently
yeah.
stands as a kind of shadow Front National vote. What do you think is it that's driving the kind of lower vote for the AfD versus the capacity in France and the UK? Is it simply that they're much further to the right, far more unreconstructed, far less ability to cut through kind of middle England or middle France? Like, what is actually the difference? Because I think there's a lot of confusion.
I think the big difference between the AfD and Marine Le Pen's party in France is Marine Le Pen made a massive effort to try to go mainstream. So the buzzword for the Rassemblement National over the last 5 years, and it's impossible to say, was dédiabolisation. That is to say, to make the party less toxic. And that meant absolutely playing down links to the far right, make the party seem like part of the sort of right wing mainstream. And I think that has been a relatively successful campaign that they have waged. And it's one that the AfD haven't really done. I mean, the AfD exists in a situation in which the German security services have branded them a threat. So they're still seen as more extreme and they've been less successful. And actually, if you wanted to put that into a UK context, that's a little bit what the Nigel Farage, Rupert Lowe argument is about, with one side arguing that actually detoxification is the way to appeal to mainstream voters. So we need to be careful about how far right we go in terms of things with our links with people like Yaxley Lennon. All far right parties struggle with this. You'll have a group that say we should go down hard and we should become even more extreme. And you'll have another group saying, actually, no, the way to electoral success is to detoxify ourselves so that mainstream voters will vote for us. And I think that's the crucial difference between those parties in France and Germany. And it's something I think that Reform UK are going to have to wrestle with, indeed are wrestling with at the moment.
That's great, and we'll try and speed up because I think that was a really interesting bit of conversation. We've got some more detail, and Ad wanted some more detail on some of the policies here. We're showing net migration concerns across. This is net agreement, just so we're really clear on each of the statements in each of the countries. The fact that we're seeing such enormous net agreement for statements like migration causes too much housing fog, and then migration may increase crime and security risks. For us, it was quite fascinating, but again, a bit closer on issues to do with migration and the economy. But nonetheless, we think, we really have reached kind of a very, very high levels of skepticism. And again, we've not even shown how this is replicated on a first past the post basis, which is even more extreme in terms of dominance from this perspective. But I think moving on a little bit to, which I think speaks to your prior point, Anand, which is around what's going on, the salience of immigration in Germany. And if you think about the fact it was 46% of people said it was a top issue in basically the final polls. And for those of you who are interested in German election forecasting, I think Focal Data has a great blog outlining some of the great work that Patrick Flynn, our data journalist, who's really led on our work in this particular field, has. For us, it was very much the case, completely agreeing with you, Anand, that the AfD had far more favourable circumstances than any other populist right, hard right party would have, and still delivering that kind of 20%-ish vote. But again, is this unprecedented, do you think, in terms of what's going on continent-wide? That we've seen it in the UK before, but have you ever seen shifts like this across all of the major European countries? but also US, Canada.
No, I think it is unprecedented. I mean, what you have is enormously high levels of voter volatility. You have historically unprecedented low vote shares for the mainstream centre left and centre right parties. You see that in elections. And you have that massive incumbency. There's a sort of anti politics feeling, anti mainstream politics feeling that seems to be there across. I mean, Canada obviously is turning into a bit of an outlier because of the impact that Donald Trump has had over polling in that country recently. I mean, Canada's a really interesting country at the moment to watch, both politically and in terms of foreign policy. But yeah, we are seeing things the like of which we haven't seen before. And the centre parties across Western Europe and in North America are struggling to figure out how best to deal with it and are not coming up with the solutions, to be perfectly honest. Part of that in Europe, of course, is due to the stuff you're going to come on to, which is that endemic failure to generate growth. And that just feeds into this general malaise, I think. I mean, it's very hard to be particularly optimistic about Europe at the moment.
Yes, it certainly felt like that when I presented these slides at the room in Brussels a couple of weeks ago. But look, I think we're going to move on away from immigration into immigration preference by country, which I think is, for me, just moving a couple of slides on. One of the most interesting bits of all, so we didn't present this a couple of weeks ago, so this is new polling. But again, I think reflects a lot of what the historic polling is. What we've asked here is that whether we think voters across these three countries, generally there were more or fewer migrants from. And you can see here very, very clear patterns between the countries. So I think the first thing is France, Germany, and the UK have quite similar views as to where they would wish more people to come from or not. Second of all, those vary drastically by country and by geography and the kind of host countries. And from our perspective, I was very struck by the German numbers. And I think this was obviously taken in light of recent security risks and attacks. But from our perspective, when do you think we will see political responses that align with these kind of figures? Like, these are drastic differences. You know, we're seeing net agreement of 80 points, more or less, in Germany between some jurisdictions. What do you think, this is less a polling question, a more political question. Given the polling here, what is the policy response? When does that happen? How is that executed?
I mean, it's incredibly difficult for policymakers, not least because, absent domestic sources of growth, the easy lever to pull is let's let more people in. What we've done here, obviously, is trial it by doing it not by nationality, but by doing what we call skills, but what we mean income. That's to say we have salary scales. I don't think anyone has happened upon the right answer to this as yet, perfectly honestly. I think West European countries in particular are struggling with low population growth and with a need to try and generate growth, and haven't been willing to have honest conversations about levels of immigration and the like. And to be honest, I can't think of a country where anything approaching a feasible, sustainable, stable solution has been reached. It'll be very interesting to watch in this country when we get the new migration figures out at the end of May, what's happening to numbers and what the public reaction is. I expect numbers to go down, but still be very high. And it's not clear as yet what the government will do. It is very, very hard to address these kinds of things. And, these numbers are, as you say, very, very striking. Again, what I would say is taken with a pinch of salt in the German case because of those recent attacks, which I think would have impacted on public opinion significantly. But I mean, the pattern from these numbers is undeniable. The other way to do this, of course, that many pollsters do is do it by profession. Would you like immigrants to come in and do A, B, and C? And that again reveals the fact that attitudes are far more complex than simple too high, too low questions will reveal to us.
And I think the other aspect that's quite interesting is the age curve. The UK in particular has been dominated by the battle of generations, basically, over the past 10 years. That's been a massive feature of our politics. I would say much less a feature of German and French politics, where region, education, identity matter much more. We see literally in the modelling, age is less of a significant factor. For us, I think it was quite interesting. It's a shame we don't have Patrick actually online to kind of talk through this, but I found it very, very striking, that the age curve is still very, very sharp in the UK. So even amongst people who are over 55s, the fact that over 55s would still prefer to have, for example, fewer Japanese people in the country or fewer people from Spain and would only just support people from Australia. I think that is really striking versus 20 and 22 point leads amongst younger voters. But it's also interesting to me, the right-hand side of the chart here, which is that even amongst the very, very youngest, which I'm no longer in the 18 to 34 age bracket, they're massively negative figures in terms of having fewer migrants versus the particular countries. I mean, these are people the very, very youngest cohort. Do you think that is? Do you think that we still have a proper handle on that? To me, I'm not. I'm quite skeptical. I think a lot of people still think of migration and immigration as a very age-coded issue, and I'm not sure. This suggests yes, there is an age gradient, but there is still. But actually, the pattern between countries is much stronger than the age gradient within the country.
No, I agree absolutely that it's not as simple as saying young people are more pro, old people are less. I think this is a really, really interesting slide in the sense that it shows even amongst young people, you have those very clear preferences about where you want people to come here from. And, those bottom countries are Muslim countries. So it's very linked to the things you're saying about security and things like that. And so, this was out of all the slides, actually, this was the one I found the most interesting simply because I hadn't expected to see those similar gradients amongst young people. So it's quite striking.
Yeah, and I think moving on, and I just describe this as the slide set of doom to N, which stands for no growth. And you can imagine how well this went down from a Brit talking in Europe about the lack of growth. But for me, we're interested here in Focal Data really about analysing the lack of European, and within that we'd include the UK, appetite for doing necessary changes to our kind of economic system to deliver growth. And we wanted to understand the cultural reasons why that was the case. And the next slide, I think, for us is really interesting because we ask Brits, French, and Germans what they were most proud of in their country. And the purpose of this was to really unpick quite how proud each respective country was of their own business. It was very striking that only 17% of Brits felt proud of the businesses that operate within those countries when you consider that private sector businesses are the source of tax receipts and money and revenue that fund our public services and our system and create wealth. It is quite interesting that 17% went for businesses, and then we've got only 14% for a political system versus, for example, 38% for music, 28% for diversity, bad findings as well in France and Germany. I mean, business has a massive brand crisis here, and I think it's coming to hit them, to hit our growth prospects. What do you think is going to turn this around? Like, how do we get people to care and understand that the source of wealth is private enterprise? Like, how does this happen?
I mean, the glib answer would be growth. If it was felt like the economy was doing well, I suspect perceptions of business would become more positive. But businesses have had a bad run over the last decade. If you think about it in this country, you think about the angry fights there have been between conservative government and businesses during the Brexit period that has helped to erode the reputation of businesses. I mean, the two things that I really found interesting on this were, firstly, I was surprised by how high the proportion was of Brits who are proud of our NHS, despite the troubles it's having. I thought, that number has stayed remarkably high. And I was struck by how little pride the Germans have in their armed forces, which again speaks to some of the slides we saw earlier about Germany when it comes to the use of force and defence spending and so on.
I mean, extraordinary 29% of people more proud of British food over our private sector businesses. And I think the next slide, I think, also looks into this into some kind of different context. This year, we've been analysing the concept of zero-sum behaviour. We are conducting a year-long study into why countries and populations and segments of the population are more zero-sum than others. So by zero-sum, we mean the kind of Gore Vidal quote of every time one of my friends does well, a little bit of me dies, and vice versa. This idea that if you do well, I do badly. If I do badly, you do well. Now, at the heart of that is the idea that wealth is a zero-sum feature and basically a fixed amount, which of course is not true entirely. Literally decades of research on free trade and stuff like that shows that broadly it's a good thing. Nonetheless, we've been measuring zero-sum attitudes across the world. In terms of this particular study, we've only looked at it in terms of 3 countries, but we really wanted to understand pro-growth versus anti-growth attitudes across different jurisdictions. And we've split this out into very simplified questions. So the first is on optimism about the future of new technologies. And again, UK and Germany come out as more pro-growth and progress. France, again, seems to be a consistently different to other, I would say, Northern European countries. If we had polled, or we have polled, like, for example, in the past, the Netherlands, Belgium, for example, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, we would see far more kind of tech optimism. It's very interesting that France, and to a degree, Italy, and some of the more southern European countries are a bit more skeptical. But we've also asked the really interesting question: will further economic growth unlock more of humanity's potential and improve people's quality of life? We found a couple of things astonishing. First of all, I think we had expected broadly 80 to 90% of each country to believe the statement that literally more money for everyone makes your life better. I mean, there are many, many things that research has consistently shown, and one of them is that if everyone is richer, people are happier. We have life ladder scores, prosperity scores. We have so many studies that look into that. Again, very interesting, 45% of France think that further economic growth will not make people happy or improve the important things in life. We really only have a 65% coalition for economic growth in Germany and a 70% one for the UK. A couple of features came out to us here, which is the UK, consistently on these different dimensions, came up as the most pro-growth country. I think that, do you think that is recent? Why do you think that is? And do you think politicians are meeting that challenge for greater growth?
Well, I mean, the answer to the last question is clearly no. No one's got growth. Do I think it's recent? No, I would guess not. I think political discourse around the economy has always been slightly different in the UK to what it is like in France and Germany. It does strike me on that second question as to whether that is a reflection of a sort of anti-growth movement or whether it's a reflection of people thinking even if we get growth it doesn't impact on me. So whether it's a distributional issue rather than something more profound about whether growth is or is not a bad thing. The other thing that the first thing I thought when I saw this was, why isn't there a stronger green movement in France, given that last question? Because those attitudes just don't seem to be reflected in the strength of green politics in France. And you'd expect them, on the back of those figures, you'd think that green politics would be stronger in France than in Germany. And it's absolutely not the case.
I guess you've got Mélenchon, who kind of bed sits exactly where,
to an extent, yeah,
the radical left party would be. You know, Nupez's performance in the assembly elections was very, very strong, even if it's slightly less strong in the second round that people didn't expected. And you're right. In many ways, the UK has the most pro-growth population that we can see of the three that we polled. I think the next slide as well puts out into really sharp relief. So we've asked here 3 growth statements to do with zero-sum thinking. The 3 statements are: people can only get rich at the expense of others, which is the core zero-sum belief. Second is economic growth will not make people happy or improve important things in life. The third is we should focus on making do with less. You can see here kind of an interesting distribution pattern, which is the majority or the plurality of each country believed none of those statements. And the more statements you are, the fewer people there were. But for me, this was quite interesting, which is that 40% of the UK, 40% of Germany is pretty pro-growth. And we think this has been the case for a long time. So there's been a lot of trapped demand for those kind of growth strategies. And it's interesting that France is a political system, when Macron is someone who's tried to deliver more growth with a much more hostile political system and a much more hostile electorate. I mean, why and how do you think that is? How did France end up with a guy that wants to raise the pension retirement age and wants to do labour market reforms? And how do we end up in the UK with where we are, given the 2 electorates?
I mean, in France, I suppose the simple answer is because it's a reform that's been long overdue and has been stalled over and over again because no one's had the political. I mean, and every time it's left, it gets slightly harder next time round. It is a very, very curious one. We're here. I mean, I think when it comes to pension reform, we've got Adair Turner to thank for basically coming out with a way of thinking about pensions that depoliticized it, that basically said, you know, you should be retired for X% of your life. As life expectancy increases, that number increases. We've made it technocratic. And actually, I have been amazed by how successful that tactic has been in this country, given the rows in other countries about pension age. But it seems that we've stumbled across something that has depoliticized the issue of increasing pension age, and it's a real public policy success in this country, I would say.
Yeah, and I think the lack of public support for the WASPy campaigners is another aspect. I mean, it was seen as a slightly ridiculous campaign, and it never captured the public mood. And I think the way that they thought it would, it just didn't. It was seen as a kind of a massive red herring. I think I just want to skip to kind of two slides on into demotivated beliefs. So demotivated beliefs are basically the particular statement that success is either entirely down to external factors or down entirely due to your own hard work. So this is to do with agency. There's another big theme that Focal Data are looking at this year. I mean, Manon, who's our growth lead, Patrick, who we mentioned is our data journalist, and myself will be doing a lot of deep dive work into high agency behavior over the next year, because we think it is very correlated with, particularly within businesses, and the propensity and desire to set up businesses as being very, very important. Believing that success is entirely an external factor is de facto a demotivating idea. For us, there was a couple of interesting things about this. This is the scale from 0 to 10. 0 is where we believe that success is entirely external. 10 is where we believe it's down entirely to our own hard work. So again, it's the classic argument between determinism and kind of free will, which is, I guess, for many of us is the original division between left and right. Couple of interesting things. First of all, the UK has a normal kind of bell curve, but that does trend towards believing more in where you are in life is down to you. But interestingly, it has far fewer partisans than other countries. So Germany and France were slightly higher numbers of people who believe demotivating beliefs. But for us, it was very interesting that only 10% of Brits, for example, were definitely sure that where you were in life is entirely down to your hard work. But 12% of Germans and 17% of French people, even though our average number was higher. In other words, this isn't a polarized debate yet in the UK, but the kind of distribution looks quite different in France. I won't ask you what you think about these sets of bell curves. It's probably not what you're expecting at 10:45. But do you think this has the potential to become a theme that we talk more about over the next year or so?
Definitely, because I think, one of the things that characterizes our politics at the moment is a sense of disengagement, of hopelessness, of the fact that, nothing can be done to solve what's going wrong in my life or in my economic circumstances or things like that. So I think that's absolutely fundamental. What I would love to see, and I'm sorry if I keep giving you more work to do, are the American figures here, because I think that would be a fascinating comparison.
They are extremely tilted towards the right.
No, I'm sure they are. And I think that would be interesting.
High agency and manifest destiny is much, much, much higher.
Absolutely. And I wonder whether on the previous slide, if you stuck in an American one, we would look quite American, I suspect, compared to some of our European partners. I think those comparisons are interesting, the degree to which we're outliers from Europe, but trend a bit more towards a sort of US perspective. On this particular one, actually, there's not a huge amount of differences yet between the countries to point to, is there?
No. And I think we'll move to our last kind of letter, and then we have a series of questions, I think, that have come in. We've had quite a lot of attendees to this webinar, so thank you for joining us. I guess a bit less optimistic than the past chapter. It was around social spending. Clearly, defence budgets are going to be restructured. The public are cognizant of that, if not fully supportive of it yet. But across these jurisdictions, we see across Britain, France and Germany, plurality, and in the case of Germany, a majority want an increase in day-to-day spending on social goods, like unemployment benefits, maternity pay, disability benefits, and the state pension. I mean, I think the statistics in the next slide kind of put that into even sharper relief, which is the working age population in Europe will increase from who are not working age, 65 and over, increase from 20 to 30 between 2025 and 2075. I believe around 5 to 10 years ago, people were pointing out European Union and Europe, the continent, of course, not the same thing. We're spending anywhere between 40 and 50% of all social spending in the world, despite being 7% of the population. Do you think that this is fine? Do you think this is sustainable? Clearly, the public do think it's sustainable. Where do you think our politics is going to go on social spending? And we'd love to hear you off mute.
The first thing I thought of when I saw the previous slide is people are going to be very, very disappointed in this country because, of course, what the government seems to be intent on doing is cutting back its spending in these areas. And insofar as you're imposing social costs, you impose them on businesses. And I think this will be an absolutely key issue for Labour in this term, whether or not they can square that circle of fiscal responsibility whilst giving people what they want in a time of increasing economic hardship. And I think this goes to the nub of all the things you're talking about here, doesn't it? Which is dissatisfaction, disengagement, poor economic performance, an expectation that the state will be able to step in at a time when states are very, very, with the exception of the German state, very, very strapped for cash. Incidentally, one thing I should add is that just the absolutely eye-watering amount of money that Merz looks to be about to unleash on the German economy is going to be really interesting to track, and the public opinion reactions to it, because 500 billion euros of infrastructure spending is an absolute game changer, it seems to me. And whether or not the government manages to spend that in a way so as to tame public discontent with mainstream politics will be a very interesting test case for all of us.
That's super. It's my turn now. I think Manon has a whole host of questions. We've only got 10 minutes left. If any of the attendees have questions, please put them into the host. We will try to answer as many of them as possible. So I think with that, Manon, why don't we go through the Q&A for this session?
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, James, and thanks so much, Anne. That was super interesting. So yeah, I think just as an initial reaction, I guess, from me to what you guys have been describing. So I think the sort of four corners of public opinion we've been talking about. So security, immigration, growth and defense. Some of these operate obviously thermostatically. You know, the increase in the salience of immigration tends to be inversely related to feelings of economic insecurity and low growth. And we know another quite strong thermostatic effect in British public opinion is tax and spend tends to move with increasing government spending. But we know that effect has been slightly dislodged by the pandemic. Government spending stayed high, but appetite for spending has also stayed high. So I guess my question is, what do you think is the government increase in spending commitments? What do you think that effect will have on people's relationship to tax and spend and also economic growth? And do you think that the linkage that the government's trying to make between increasing in sort of defense spending and growth kind of makes sense within the context of these thermostatic relationships?
Right. A nice, easy morning question. I'll take that. And then, Manon, you can find an easier question for the next. So I think what Manon is trying to parse is something really extraordinary has happened in UK public opinion in the last 5 years, which is for the first time since the 1970s, since the British Social Attitude Survey has been tracking how the public think the size of the state should be and whether taxes should increase or decrease, whether the state should increase in size or decrease, is largely actually tracked actual spending from the government as a percentage of GDP. They've acted like a form of homeostasis. We've actually got the graph. I think Patrick will maybe potentially find that graph and put it for the respondees. COVID broke that natural process whereby the public responded to a state that was too small or too large by changing their fiscal attitudes. So effectively, you had the size of the state ballooning, but people for the first time, really since modern public opinion tracking had occurred in the UK, not realizing that public spending had gone up and not demanding a smaller state, and therefore not demanding the political things that they'd expect to. I think that the way that the same thing then increased, I think, with the potential for what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and then the war, which is that will be seen as special spending. That will be seen as necessary spending outside the normal kind of politics. But of course, just because you're spending for something in an exceptional circumstance doesn't mean you pay for it with exceptional money. You pay for it with normal money, and you still have to go to the bond markets. And I think this is potentially going to lead to a bit of a moment for Europe in particular, where we are spending a huge amount of money. The public are not responding in kind with demand for a smaller state, further cuts. This to me is all the hallmarks, if you look at it, of Europe marching eventually towards a debt crisis, because there's no break effectively from public opinion on how much is going to be spent. But Anand, you're the professor of European politics. I'll leave it to you.
I mean, you can go to the bond markets or you can go to the public. I mean, it does seem to me, ever since the sort of Trump-Zelensky press conference that went so badly south, it struck me that there is, in a curious kind of way, an opportunity here for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves to appear in front of Parliament and say, look, we were elected in a time of peace. We're governing in a time of war. The assumptions that govern the pledges we made in opposition no longer hold. I mean, some of the pledges they made in opposition, the Labour Party has its hands tied partly by the promises it made in opposition. It's not just by the state of the economy, but it's about the tax promises they made in opposition. I do wonder whether, given the fact that we see in your polling and in lots of other polling, the fact that what's been happening internationally is impacting significantly on public opinion in a number of ways, there isn't an opening here for a kind of political intervention to reset the terms of economic debate and be a bit more straight with the British public about where we are. I'm not holding my breath on that, but it does strike me that this moment in international relations is one where we're all going to have to reassess what the state does, how it pays for it, and maybe recalibrate some of the assumptions that were made prior to what's happened in the last few weeks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for that, Anand. I got two more questions. So the next one is specifically around zero-sum thinking. So I'm really pleased you raised that, James. And I think the way that you sort of framed it was, yeah, the zero-sum thinking is kind of the source code of the populist right and also elements of the populist left. But it's also more complicated than that. So the Harvard paper from 2024 last year showed that it was also higher among certain ethnic groups. It was highest among people on actually both sides of the income curve. So it's actually more complicated, I guess, than, low growth equals populism. And so I guess, and, given this kind of relationship is a bit more complicated, what do you think that implies around, for actors trying to tackle, I guess, populist politics? If it's not really as simple as, low growth equals populism, really what are the openings, what are the corners that are potentially kind of explored by those actors in terms of trying to kind of counter some of those movements?
I think the really interesting case study here is net zero, because of course in opposition, Labour made a very ambitious attempt to set out a path that made growth and addressing net zero complementary objectives. So to make it explicitly positive sum, of course, faced with the reality of the fiscal situation and the fact that £28 billion a year was an awful lot of money, they've rode back from that. But I think that is the key area to watch, to see if governments are able successfully to turn potentially zero-sum stories into positive stories. Whether you can sell a narrative that says rapid adaptation to climate change is not just something we have to do because of climate change, but is an economic opportunity. Now, my sense is that Labour winning that argument at the moment, or are certainly not driving home that argument as aggressively as they could. But I do think there are chances there to see precisely the sort of positive sum thinking that could help turn things around.
Great. Thank you very much. I guess just turning to one sort of final question for both of you. So I guess at Focal Data, we're thinking quite carefully about two big elections happening later this year. So I think the Australian federals in May and Canada in the autumn. And obviously what we've seen out of the dynamics playing out in the run-up to those elections is that the effect of Trump is actually meeting a kind of growing confidence for the middle ground, for the kind of soft right. And we've also seen that in the UK. Some of Starmer's proudest moments in the last few weeks have been kind of reaction to some of the kind of moves Trump is making. So I guess to get you thinking a little bit about the future. So what do you think is kind of the nature of this relationship between, the Trump effect, the effect of kind of right-wing politics, and what does that mean for kind of the middle ground? And I guess the left, the UK is one of the only countries in a kind of increasingly moving to the right world, which has a, Labour government that's going to be in office for the next 4 to 5 years. So yeah, I was keen to get your reactions on that as the kind of closing comments.
You're making me go first, James. Okay. I mean, I'd say a couple of things. I think here, my view really hasn't changed very much, that actually getting a degree of economic growth and fixing public services are the crucial things ahead of the next election. If Labour shows some progress on both of those, then it's in a pretty good position. The actual impact of Trump obviously varies by country and by situation, and it's far, far more acute in Canada, given the rhetoric. I mean, remarkable rhetoric. And actually, just going back to some of your polling, I have found it interesting how reluctant our government has been to express support for Canada, who, after all, share a head of state with us over the threats being made from the Trump administration. I mean, it is a strange situation in Canada, isn't it? Because initially when I heard that Mark Carney was standing, my reaction was, Mark Carney isn't the person you need to face a populist threat, the sort of arch technocrat. Maybe that's changing in the light of Trump. I don't think the impact here will be anything as large, simply because we're not facing the same sort of pressure from the Trump administration. Though it will be interesting to watch. We haven't really talked about that today. What attitude towards Trump turn into in terms of attitude towards those people in our political system who are seen as allies of or close to Donald Trump. And I think that story's got quite a long way to go as yet. And it hinges on something we can't predict, which is what exactly Donald Trump goes on to do over the next 4 years.
Yeah, actually, interestingly, we've got 3 minutes left. I have a slightly different take, which is that I think in Canada, what there has clearly been is a rally around the flag, but the flag depends on whether you think about province or country. And the Canadian Conservatives have always struggled because they're not the party of Canada. They haven't governed. They're effectively not in power for a third of time because they're not seen as of the nation in the way that maybe other centre-right parties are. It's very, very distinct. The CPC is one of the least successful centre-right parties in the English-speaking world. And it's interesting there, the rally around the flag. Doug Ford did have that. I mean, there was a Conservative win due to Trump in Ontario, which is a third of Canada. So I think it depends on which person can authentically be of the people. And clearly, Doug Ford, third election, I think victory in a row, huge numbers of seats for him in the previous election. So we had a bit of contact there. He's really of Ontario, right? Him and his brother, and is now deceased, but obviously that family have a huge history. Pierre Poilievre is dealing with a CPC that has structurally far more skepticism amongst the Canadian public. They can look to other Canadians to be more authentically Canadian, as opposed to the CPC, who is still viewed with some suspicion. I think Trump poses a couple of challenges, which is the right in general, which is first his economics. This is a guy that is pro-tariffs, which is fundamentally not a core tenet of centre-right thinking. It is across the new socially conservative kind of radical right, but it is absolutely antithetical to kind of economically right-wing policies. The second is, of course, the fact that Trump has gone much harder on kind of zero-sum thinking that is not necessarily in line with other centre-right parties in terms of the idea that wealth can be expanded and kind of lower taxes and barriers to entry and supply-side reform can help growth. That's clearly not his view. It is within the country, but not between. The third is obviously on a domestic alliance. Centre-right parties will want to avoid being tainted by Trump. Trump's numbers are really, really bad across the rest of the Western world. Yes, there are small pluralities of people that are warm to him in certain countries, but I think in almost every single Western country, more people dislike him than like him, except for the crucial one, which is the US. So I think it creates a lot of challenges, I think, for the right, but we shouldn't overplay. Like, people don't get up in the UK and France and Germany and think about Donald Trump. Maybe they should, but they have their own lives, their own domestic policies, and their own domestic politics to get into. Obviously, one political system is clearly affecting another, but I think it's just more complicated than that. So I think it does pose challenges for the right, but I don't think they should be overplayed. Every country has its own dynamics. And I think that puts us neatly up to 11 o'clock. Thank you for everyone who stayed. It's been hopefully a fantastic hour. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Anand. And thank you for sharing this. Please do check out Focal Data. For all of our research, we have extremely long blogs that currently nobody reads, and we'd love people to read them because there's some really great research. And thank you for your time. Thank you.